Today I'm sewing and sharing the Milou pattern by fabricstore.com. This is a free pattern that you can find on their website. I've left a link for you below so you can check out all the details and sew along with me. A couple things I want to note before I get sewing. Firstly, the notches on my front skirt bodice piece were a little bit closer together than what I was seeing in the pattern's written instructions. I just went by the notches that were marked on my pattern piece, which resulted in a more concentrated gather on my front and back pieces. The alternative would have been to do what I was seeing in the pattern instructions, to gather from one outer notch all the way to the corner of the inset. So as you're doing your gathering, keep in mind that you can do it the way that I'm doing in the video, or you can widen your gathering area and do it as illustrated in the pattern instructions. The other thing to note is that the sleeve pieces are symmetrical, meaning that it doesn't matter which sleeve you put into which armhole. So you can keep this in mind as you're color blocking to note that you have this freedom to play with your colors or with your stripes. I hope you sew along with me, so grab that pattern, cut out your fabric, mark your notches, and let's get started. On the front and back side bodice skirt piece, you have notches indicating where we're going to be gathering these pieces. I've marked these notches onto my fabric. I'm going to take this piece to the sewing machine and use basting stitches from notch to notch, leaving thread tails on both sides so I can pull those stitches for gathering. I'm going to be using about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now grab your corresponding bodice piece and place the bottom edge of that bodice piece right sides together with the top gathered edge of the skirt piece. Pin the side edges of the bodice piece to these side edges of the skirt piece. And then pull your gathering stitches so that the skirt fits perfectly with the bottom of the bodice. Once those edges are fit together and the gathers are distributed evenly, go ahead and finish pinning in place. Now I'm going to flip my bodice piece upward. Then I'm going to flip the bodice and the skirt piece so that I can pin the side of the bodice right sides together with the remainder of the skirt and bodice piece. Now that that side of the bodice is right sides together with the remainder of the skirt and bodice piece, I'm going to pin that vertical seam together. Now that I have those two seams pinned, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew those seams, pivoting at this corner with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn, you can finish your seams in your preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. And then repeat all of these steps to attach your remaining bodice piece to your remaining bodice skirt piece. Once your front and back dress pieces are sewn, press your seams away from the bodice inset. Place your front and back dress pieces right sides together and match your shoulder seams. And pin in place. Sew your shoulder seams at a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seams. I've taken my neckband piece to my ironing board and folded it in half lengthwise, wrong sides together. Now I'm going to find the center of my neckband, and I'm going to match that center of my neckband with the center of my front bodice, matching the raw edges and pin in place. I'm going to continue pinning both sides of the neckband until they meet at the center back. Now for both loose ends of the neckband, I want to mark on each side where the neckband meets the center back of the neckline. I'm going to open out the fold of that neckband and place a pin in the binding where the binding meets the center back. And then do the same for the other half of the binding. Now that I have those center backs marked on each end of the binding strip, I'm going to place those opened out binding strips right sides together, matching those pins and pinning in place. I'm going to quickly take this to my sewing machine and sew a straight line down, sewing those binding strips together from that center point that we marked. Now that those ends of the binding are sewn together, I can trim off the excess, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you can press that seam allowance open. Then fold that binding strip back in half, wrong sides together, and complete the pinning around the neckline. Now take your dress back to your machine and sew the binding to the neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now trim that neckline seam allowance by about half. And then we'll make tiny clips into that seam allowance all the way around, carefully clipping to the stitching line but not beyond, so that the binding turns nicely to the inside of the garment. And then we can turn our binding to the inside of the garment, right along its seam line, and then give that seam line a really good press all the way around. Now that I have that binding pressed to the inside of the garment, I'm going to take a garment label and sew it to the neckband only right over that center back seam. Now that I have my label secured, I'm ready to pin the binding around the neckline, maintaining that nice pressed seam line all the way around. Now I'm going to go back to my sewing machine, and I'm going to edge stitch close to this inner fold of the neck binding all around the neckline. Place your lower sleeve panel right sides together with its corresponding sleeve and pin in place. Sew your seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seam. To make it easier to fit your sleeve into the arm side, go ahead and baste from notch to notch with the longest stitch on your machine, making sure to leave thread tails on both sides so that you can ease it into the arm side. Place your color blocked sleeve right sides together with this paneled portion of your dress, making sure that the single notch of your sleeve matches the single notch of your bodice, and pin in place across the arm side. As you're pinning the sleeve to the bodice, go ahead and pull those basting stitches as needed for a perfect fit. And then place your remaining sleeve right sides together with the opposite arm side. Ease that in place and pin in the same way. Now take your dress to the sewing machine and sew the sleeves to the dress with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then finish your seams. Place your front and back dress pieces right sides together and pin from the bottom of the dress to the bottom of the sleeve. And do this pinning on both sides. Sew the seam from the bottom of the sleeve all the way to the bottom of the dress with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, doing this on both sides and then finishing both of your side seams. The hem allowance for the bottom of the dress is 1 inch. I've taken the raw edge of the bottom of the dress to the ironing board and I folded up to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, and then again by another 1/2 inch, creating a rolled hem. Now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around. And you're going to hem the bottoms of your sleeves in the same way, folding and pressing those raw edges to the wrong side by 1/2 inch and then 1/2 inch again, and edge stitching close to the inner fold all the way around both sleeves. Give everything a nice final press and you're all done with your dress. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.